And again, we have been doing a lot of work in Brazil on reform. I'll say more about this later. But it's amazing. Again, my name is Mauricio Fonte. I'm director of the Economic Center. We have George Alves, who is going to be moderator today. And we have two distinguished guests. One Brazilian American, who lives most of his time in Brazil. Fleischer. And Tony Spanakos, who has been studying Brazil for quite a while.
Mauricio, the mic is going to work. You have to talk into it.
You have to talk into it. And then I also did something on concessions in the reform, in the context of the reform process. I'll refer to this later. We have a very exciting moment in Brazil, of course, and the question is another exciting moment. The question is to make sense of it. To do that, we need to go back and look at works on democracy and thinking, fresh thinking, because this is clearly a new situation. And then we are doing that today with the eye toward perhaps printing a new book, producing a new book. If we find ourselves excited enough to do that. And I actually am, because I think the last 2 days things have happened in Brazil that kind of make me turn my head and say, wow, more, more exciting. So, George, you want to take over?
Sure. So welcome everybody. It's great to be here again. Thank you, Mauricio and the Bildner Center for organizing, continue to organize this series. It's been interesting times since last time we saw you guys in November. We tried to make as much sense as we could at that point of changes, and the room was claiming for some sense that I'm not quite sure we could offer a lot. So today we get to revisit that and continue to try to see what tools we can use to try to make sense of the situation. We're going to start with David. David is going to be talking about political reforms, especially the reforms, the proposed reforms for raising the requirements for threshold that would try to limit the number of small parties. So David is going to kickstart, then Tony Spanakos is going to be talking to us a little bit, and then Mauricio, and then I'm going to be kind of moderating and filling in and bringing in the audience as well for questions. So let's start with David.
All right. Before I begin, I'd like to make a plug for this book, which is about Marechal Rondon, published in Brazil. Larry Reuter is the author right here. And it's a book that you can purchase in Brazil. It's not in an English version yet here in the U.S.
Next year.
Next year, okay. So just to make a plug for this book about Rondon.
What's the main theme, Larry? What's the main theme of the book? Main point?
The main theme, I guess I would say, is that Rondon is one of the chief architects of the First
David, do you want your
Republic.
hand?
I'm trying to pull it
I
up.
can pull it up
Both
for
in
you.
terms of the infrastructure he built,
She can
but
do
also the
here.
construction of institutions, such as the, Serviço de Proteção ao Índio,
Let's make sure your microphone is on.
and the maintenance of a secular state, fending off the attempts by the Roman Catholic Church to regain the ground lost in the fall of the monarchy in 1889.
You're interested, we'd like to do maybe a discussion based on your book.
Yes, so I'd be happy to come some.
Good. Let's usually are not looking for.
Well, as George said, I'm going to discuss political reform in Brazil and the most recent reforms that went into effect for the 2018 elections. So political reform in Brazil, elections and political parties. Well, we've had many political reform attempts in Brazil. First was the 1988 Constitution. Then we had a special committee in the Chamber of Deputies which proposed a very, very interesting reform back in 2003, but was never voted on in the Chamber. In the 2006 elections, we had a 5% exclusion clause, which we'll look at, which was declared unconstitutional. Then in 2010, we had the Ley de Ficha Limpa, which was the clean records law, that if you had been convicted of any crime by a federal or state court, you would be ineligible for 8 years. Then the Supreme Court did a reform back in 2015 and said all private sector campaign contributions were unconstitutional. Then, in 2015, Congress passed a barrier on individual candidates. We're going to look at that in just a minute. This barrier on individual candidates said, okay, this was the anti-Tiririca law, because we have something called locomotives in Brazil, individual candidates who pull in 1 million or whatever, 1.5 million, 2 million votes, and then they pull in other candidates on their list, on their party or coalition list, with very, very small vote totals. So we're going to look at that. And then there's the minimum barrier for parties adopted in 2017. And so these two threshold barriers here, 2015 and 17, are what we're going to look at. Well, where did all this begin? Threshold barriers. In May 1949, West Germany, then West Germany, passed its basic law, which imposed a 5% barrier for parties in PR, proportional representation elections, saying that if your party didn't get 5% of the valid vote, you don't elect anyone. And this was combined with a mixed election system of district and proportional. Well, this was adopted because in the Weimar period, the Weimar Republic, there were 40 parties represented in the Bundestag. We're getting to that point in Brazil, almost. We now have, last year we had, I think, 30 or 31 parties elected, at least one deputy. So we're getting close to the Weimar in Brazil. So this facilitated the Nazi Party assuming the government with Hitler as prime minister in 1933. The president called the party that had the largest delegation in the Bundestag, which I think was like 10%. That person didn't work out. And then he called the second and the third largest party. When he called the fourth largest party, which was the Nazi Party, then that was it, the end. So since 1949, several nations have adopted a threshold barrier. Not always 5%, sometimes less, sometimes more. Brazil had its first attempt at a threshold barrier in 2006. The party law, which was passed in 1995, had a 5% threshold barrier. But this was postponed by Congress every 4 years. Well, let's put it into effect next election. And then before the next election, postpone again. So finally, in 2005, they forgot to postpone this barrier because of the Mensalon scandal in 2005. So the 5% barrier went into effect in the 2006 elections. In these elections, 21 parties elected at least one deputy. Because in Brazil, we use a proportional representation with what's called open list, and also with election coalitions. This, to my mind, is the worst election system in the world. Okay, so this is what the results were in 2006. So as you can see, we had 7 parties that got more than the 5% cutoff barrier. And then we had these other 14 parties with less than 5%. And as you can see, these parties had had between 1 and 5%. And then these other parties had less than 1%. But because of election coalitions, a lot of these parties were able to elect 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever, deputies. So, only 7 parties got more than 5%. And another 7 in the middle got between 5 and 1%. And then 7 parties had less than 1%. And 8 parties had less than 1.5%. So this threshold as a barrier didn't really bar or prohibit any of the 14 parties that received less than 5%. if you'll pardon my French, this is what I call a half-ass barrier, okay? So rather these parties could not have a leadership position in the Chamber of Deputies, and their 118 deputies could not be assigned to any standing committees. So that was the barrier or the punishment for being a small party. They became what was called in the Brazilian press second-class parties. For this reason, shortly after the elections, the Supreme Court declared that this arrangement was unconstitutional, with very good reason. I mean, how can you have a first-class deputy and a second-class deputy? Had this 5% barrier in 2006 been the German type of barrier, saying, okay, you didn't get 5%, you don't elect anyone, I'm sure the Supreme Court would have declared that constitutional. Since then, there have been no changes applied to the 2010 and 2014 elections until 2015 and 2017, and these two changes went into effect in the 2018 elections. In 2015, this Law 13-165 provided an individual barrier. This was approved on the 27th of October 2015. To be elected deputy, a federal deputy or state deputy, the candidate would have to have at least 10% of the state's election quotient. Now, in proportional representation, you know what an election quotient is to elect deputies. So this was to bar the effects of locomotives or candidates with large vote totals. For example, in 2002, former presidential candidate Enéas Farias of the then Prona party polled 1.57 million votes in São Paulo for deputy and pulled in another 5 other candidates on his list, some of whom had only 400 or 500 votes. That's an example of how this locomotive effect worked. So the reform went into effect for the 2018 elections. As we'll see in the tables I'm going to present to you, the PSL, which is Bolsonaro's party, lost in quotes, 7 deputies in São Paulo because of 2 locomotives, puxadores de votos. Eduardo Bolsonaro, President Bolsonaro's son, received 1.8 million votes, and Joyce Hasselman, a journalist, received a little more than 1 million votes. So these 2 puxadores pulled in, or should have elected, 17 deputies under the old rules. But, as we'll see, 7 of the PSL candidates did not receive 10% of the election quotient, so they were not elected. So these 7 seats were then redistributed to 6 other parties, which we'll see in the table. This also happened to the Novo party, which is, Novo means new, in Rio Grande do Sul. This party elected 2 deputies, but the second place candidate did not have 10% of the election quotient, so this seat went to the PTB party. So, as you can see, in the state of São Paulo, the PSL, without this barrier clause, would have elected 17 deputies, but only elected 10, lost 7. And Rio Grande do Sul elected 2, but lost 1, and only elected 1. So how did this work out? These are the parties. As you can see here in Rio Grande do Sul, elected 8, but with this is the coalition, only elect, these are the seats gained. So you can see in São Paulo, there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parties that gained seats. This coalition here would have elected only 15 without the clause, but would gain 2 more seats. And you can see how that worked out. As you can see, elected by the clause, you can see the parties that elected deputy because of the results of the clause. And you can see in São Paulo, the Democrats elected 2. As you can see, their vote totals were pretty high, but in their coalition, it wasn't enough to get elected. So you can see which deputies were pulled in because of this clause, including Orlando Silva, PCdoB, quite well known in São Paulo in Brazil, for example. Now, these are the people who should have been elected without the clause, but who were not elected. You can see there was one from the Noble Party in Rio Grande do Sul who had 11,000 votes. And these others in Sao Paulo were the PSL, 25, 24, 24, 23, 22,000 votes, but less than 10% of the election quotient in Sao Paulo. Okay. In 2017, they approved another barrier clause for parties, Law 13488, approved on the 6th of October, 2017, the last day possible for election law changes. In Brazil, we have a norm, a law that says any changes on the election system have to be approved by Congress 1 year before the next election. So this barrier stated that if a party did not receive 1.5% of the valid proportional vote, it would not receive any money from the National Party Fund, nor any free radio or TV time distributed by the election court. And this is considered enough to kill any party. No money and no TV time. And although this has not been decided by the Supreme Court whether this is constitutional, but most people think that it will be maintained as constitutional. 21 parties surpassed the 1.5 barrier. 14 parties received less than 1.5, and 9 of the latter elected at least one deputy, 26 deputies, and 5 of the latter received 0 deputies. So this table is divided into 2 parts, 2A, and then we're going to see 2B. So these are the 21 parties that got more than 1.5% of the valid vote. You can see how these worked out. As you can see, the PSL, Bolsonaro's party, elected 52, but they lost to 7 deputies in Sao Paulo, and should have had 59. The PT elected 56. That's why the PSL has a larger vote total than the PT. So you can see all of these parties surpassed the 1.5% barrier. And this is table 2B, which shows you the parties that received less than 1.5% of the valid vote. So you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Elected at least one deputy. But these other really dinky parties, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, elected 0 deputies. And as you can see, this PCO, one of the Communist parties, had 0%, only less than 3,000 votes. So these parties would be off the TV tube, no TV propaganda, and would not receive any quota from the National Party Fund. So what's happening now in the first semester is that since October last year, several of these 9 parties have merged, and some others have been incorporated by larger parties. Also, 7 senators have switched out of these 9 parties into some other larger parties in order to maintain their access to the party fund and to free radio and TV time. Okay, now another kicker. The law that was passed in 2017 also determined that this barrier over time would increase to 2% in 2022, 2.5% in 2026, and 3% in 2030, a gradual increase over time. Also, now this is where the real kicker is, this law contains another even stronger barrier that will prohibit election coalitions in proportional elections, either for city council or for deputy. So as of 2020 in the municipal elections, there will be no election coalitions. And as of the general elections in 2022, no election coalitions. Some 10 or 12 parties in Brazil can only elect deputies via party coalitions. So this would probably, in 2022, further reduce the number of parties in the Chamber of Deputies. So we'll have to wait and see whether Congress makes any changes on these barriers or not this year or next year. Any changes for the bearing on the municipal elections would have to be done before October 5th this year. And any changes for the 22 elections would have to be done before the 1st of October 2021. So we'll have to wait and see whether any changes to revise these barriers will be made or not. I hope not. That's my observation. In Brazil, in our political science group, we have two currents of opinion. What I call the governability group, that's my group, we think that Brazil should function quite well, governability, with 9 or 10 parties. But the other group, the representation group, says no. The more parties, the better, because then you can represent all segments of Brazilian public and political opinions across the nation. So I tell this group, okay, you're getting very close to the Weimar Republic with 40 parties in Congress. So we'll have to wait and see. Because why? You have a president like Bolsonaro, or like Lula, or like Dilma, or like Temer. These presidents have to put together a governing coalition to be able to govern. In Portuguese, we have two words. Coligação with a G. Coligação means an election coalition. Coalizão with a Z means a governing coalition in Congress. Because we need 60% in each house to pass a constitutional amendment, this means that if the president wants to have good governability, he or she needs at least 65 or 70% of the deputies and senators in their governing coalition. Bolsonaro has this problem because he's not been able to put together a governing coalition because he says, I'm doing the new politics. I'm not doing the old politics. The old politics is pork barrel with give and take, and you distribute goodies, political goods, to the deputies and senators to guarantee their participation in your governing coalition. What are the goodies that you traditionally distribute? One are political jobs. Brazil has the president of Brazil has 25,000 political appointments to make, federal appointments all over the country. And deputies want these for their people to help them get reelected. The other goodie that's passed out are budget amendments that the deputies have put together, or senators, again to help them in their bailiwicks or their constituencies to get reelected. And so Bolsonaro said, no, we're not going to use the old politics, but he's not really described to us how the new politics is going to operate. So he has had great difficulty in approving certain things because he does not have a good governing coalition put together within Congress. So my presentation this afternoon is about these two barriers, but in the question period, we can go into any other questions you may have about the current Brazilian political scene. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mauricio. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, David. Mauricio, a second ago. Now we have Tony Spanakos.
It was such a great presentation, and we thank you, David. Why is that a problem, really, other than forming coalitions? Why is the number of parties, which is huge, on so mountain issue? Okay, the Weimar Republic it was. Is it always the case?
Oh, questions now, okay. Yes. Why do we have so many political parties in Brazil?
No,
Because,
the question is, why does it matter? I mean,
Why is it awful?
oh, why is it a problem? Okay. Well, it's a problem because the president, if he or she wants to have a good governing coalition, has to put together this governing coalition in Congress with maybe 13, 14, 15 parties. And it's extremely difficult for the president to maintain this coalition cohesive and loyal to vote what the president wants. And so the main problem with having too many parties is that it makes the governing coalition for the president to construct and maintain very difficult. So if you had 9 or 10 parties in Congress, it would be much easier or less difficult for the president to organize his or her governing coalition.
Isn't that what a good political system is supposed to do when you aggregate functions? We
Yes.
do it one way here, we have all kinds of factions. We have an increasing number of factions. Why not? Why shouldn't the Brazilian system be able to aggregate?
Well, because it's very difficult to aggregate these parties. If you have 30, 32, or 33 parties in Congress, to put together a cohesive, continuous coalition has proven quite difficult. Lula had difficulties in maintaining his coalition, especially in his first term, and Dilma had great difficulties in maintaining the coalition. This was part of why she was impeached. And Temer, as her successor, had even less support, popular support, maybe only 20% popular approval rating. And so he had great difficulty maintaining his coalition functioning in Congress as well. So it's a very difficult situation.
Right, just to jump in, since Mauricio started the conversation here, I think the question that Mauricio posed for you, David, comes from the comparative politics of presidential systems and coalitional presidentialism and all those things, right? It seems to be that the comparative politics literature assumes that the more you disperse power in the greater number of political parties, then the harder it will be to govern, right? But I think what you hinted at here in this debate in the Brazilianists, in these different camps that you call the governability camp or the representation camp, is that, you know, that might be up for debate. Like maybe if you strengthen the opposition into a smaller number of parties, maybe they drive an even harder bargain. And it might be harder, right? We don't necessarily know this. Every time that a president has tried to govern in new politics without Congress or without coalitional presidentialism, we have what? We have Collor, we have the Mensalão scandal, and we have the impeachment of Dilma and those things. So I guess if you could talk a little bit more about this, do we know, we're assuming that shrinking the number of parties will be a beneficial thing, but I guess that's at the heart of Mauricio's comment and question.
I'm not entirely convinced.
It's the fetishization of efficiency, that less is better.
Over dispersion.
But in
yeah.
science, what we're seeing with DNA, expansion of numbers can also give you good results. And so it's a valid argument, but it may not stand up historically.
Well, the argument, he mentioned Collor. At that point, I think Collor had something like 15 parties in Congress. But Collor was never able to put together a majority because he was elected by a very small party and elected on what you would call an individual political platform in 1989. And so Collor governed by medida provisórias and decrees because he didn't have a majority to pass anything in Congress. And so that was one of the reasons why he ended up being impeached. He was impeached basically because his brother had an interview with Veja magazine and laid out all of the misdemeanors and crimes that he had committed as president. Cardozo was able to put together an adequate coalition, especially in his first term, to pass things. So the experience then showed that Lula in his first term had some difficulties, especially with the Mensalão scandal, but was reelected in 2006. And in his second term, he was buoyed by the commodity splurge internationally, and the economy boomed in his second term to the point where Brazil had a 7.5% GDP growth in 2010, and Lula left with an 83% approval rating. But then Dilma had considerable difficulties putting her coalition together to operate in Congress, especially in her second term. And so Temer had even greater difficulties in his term of office between 2016 and 18. So the experience shows that many presidents have had difficulties putting together an adequate coalition to be able to govern. Itamar Franco, when he took over after Collor was impeached, Itamar was able to put together a fairly large coalition to govern during the second half of his and Paulo's term in office. But the history shows that several presidents have had great difficulties maintaining this presidential governing coalition functioning. We have this theory of how presidential coalition governments operate in Brazil, first described in a journal article by Sergio Abraxas. And so this phenomenon of coalition government in Brazil has continued. But the evidence shows that some presidents have had great difficulty putting together and maintaining these coalitions to be able to govern. So it's not only my observation as a governability adept, but also the historical observation of some of the presidents who had great difficulty governing because they could not put together an adequate governing coalition.
Just one last follow-up question. Can I?
Sure.
On the other hand, we do know that corruption has been a reason for the failures of many of these presidencies, which suggests that the problem is not necessarily with the elections and parties, but with the way in which the state operates. If we go back to elections after 1988, only Cardoso has not had problems with all being impeached or being impeached. The others have.
No, Lula wasn't impeached.
Well, Lula is in jail.
Yeah, Lula's in jail. That's another type of impeachment.
Can we jump in now here, or are you guys gonna?
Mauricio, how would you like to save a little bit more, maybe get
No,
Tony in and
I'm
then?
gonna flag the question for later when
Yeah.
I take some.
So maybe so we don't get it. Tony, how do you feel?
Yeah, let's wait for questions at the end.
Yeah,
Okay.
so speaker's prerogative. So I'm sorry, David would like to field questions at the
At the end.
at the end.
After.
So let's hold on to that. We wanna hear from everybody. So let's keep the conversation going so that we can have a good Q&A towards the end. So now we've got Tony Spanakos.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Mauricio, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and to see some old friends who are visiting. And it's wonderful that the Bildner Center has been able to continue such a fine tradition of talking about Brazilian politics, particularly the questions of political reform over the past 2 decades. And I'm grateful to be part of that. I'm going to do something a little bit different from what David was doing, and hopefully it will function in a way that's also going to foment some conversation. I often like starting with a quote from Alice in Wonderland, which I think is very helpful. And there's this beautiful moment where Alice says, "I see nobody on the road." And then the king responds saying, "Oh, I wish I had those eyes, because you see nobody. And from such a distance too. Why, it's as much as I can do to see real people by this light." And I say that because what I want to focus on today is what it is that we or those around us are seeing, because I think that tells a lot of the story. For the last several years, I've been working on a book on basically Venezuelan and Brazilian politics, looking at how Bob Kaufman was kind enough to give me comments earlier on a few years ago on this, but how these different groups that came into power that sought to democratize democracy did very different projects. And if we look at particularly what has happened in Venezuela and Brazil over the past 15, 20 years, we can see some very interesting divergences and convergences at different times. But one of the things that struck me, and I think many other people at the time, was this discussion of democratizing democracy. What does it actually mean? And that has not always led itself to great results. That leads us to the present, where the overwhelming discussion about Brazil now, which is very different from what was happening a few years ago, is Brazil is in crisis. Democracy is in crisis. Democracy is threatened. We just, a couple of days ago, many of us were at the Latin American Studies Association meeting where all these discussions were taking place at a scholarly level, not simply at what we hear in the news. And I want to try to address this a little bit by saying that much of this has to do with what we think of as the concepts that we use to identify what democracy is and how we can make it further democratic, And in sociology, we often refer to this as the problem of the imaginary, or in Portuguese, it would be imaginário social, imaginário político. So what I'd like to do is just identify a couple of moments here, talking about the present, right? So we are in this environment where there's a lot of discussion about crisis, and there are a lot of things that are distressing to many people, commentators, citizens, etc., about what has happened in Brazilian politics recently. And part of the shock to me is how much of a surprise this is to so many people. Because there have been many shocks in recent years, and many of the things that we are discussing are not terribly new. I was at a panel a few days ago where there was a discussion about police violence in Brazil, and I remember when I was writing my dissertation 20 years ago, this is what we were talking about. And so much of what we see is not really terribly new. If you think about the election of Bolsonaro, this is certainly something that shocked many people because this was somebody who was not part of the PCDB or the PT, winning the presidency. But if we go back a couple of years and we think about the June days of 2013, these mass protests which shocked essentially the world, where this small group, the Movimento Passa Livre, who nobody had heard of, had suddenly shaken the entire continent. Even the people on the far left, even the MST, all these people who thought of themselves as being the vanguard of the democratic left in Latin America had not even heard of this. And very quickly, these June protests became protests of all people, far right, far left, everybody went out and protest. If we think of the impeachment process and the allegations that it was an impeachment, it was a soft coup, it was a constitutional coup, however people would call it, this was an indication of a very, very serious lack of consensus among people who were commenting on Brazilian reality. And if we go back a little further, obviously the Lava Jato investigation, which has jailed many, many people from many different parties, has also been viewed in very, very polarizing contexts. And we can go back to 2010, the election there, where even though the Rousseff Handley won re-election, it was a very intense and a very polarized election in a way that previous elections, I think, have been less so, at least under the Lula administrations. So I want to just focus on a couple of time periods. The first is, and for those of you who are political scientists or historians, you may remember in around 2006 or so, Peter Smith came out with a second edition of his book, Democracy in Latin America. And he really started it beautifully with Lula's election and Chavez's re-election, and sort of these are the two options that are out there. And that was a time when the left was increasingly winning presidential victories, and there was this idea that there were two lefts. There was a more radical left, a more anti-institutional left, if you will, and then there was a more institutional left, a more moderate left. And for several years, partially because of the commodity boom, both of those lefts were relatively, it was possible to continue the projects and to seem as though one seemed much more radically democratic or frightening, depending on where you are, and the other one seemed to please everybody, and that was the Brazilian model. So Brazil seemed to be the good democratic country. It was a country that was really finally making it. It was not only finally turning the corner, as Al Fischlo and others had said, and in your book, but it had not just turned a corner, but it was now teaching the rest of the world about democracy. It was teaching the rest of the world because of participatory budgeting, because of Bolsa Familia, because of innovations in terms of health, and it was all about clean government and transparency. And at a certain time, it appeared that that was no longer the case. If we fast forward to the point when the commodity boom really starts to be more evident, okay, so the commodities dropped around 2011, but then 2014 was a sharp drop in commodities. What do we see? We see a new era emerge. Globally, the Journal of Democracy has this major forum on what do we do now? We have 10 years in which the amount of democracy in the world has allegedly decreased. We see 2016 a very important year because we have the Brexit vote, which shocked many people. We have the Trump vote, and one thing in Latin America that most people don't pay attention to is the vote against the peace plan in Colombia. There was this real big change that was happening globally, and for those of us who study democracy, there's this whole discussion about what's going on. And I think the response from most people studying was there's this reaction, it's a backlash, it's right-wing, it's populist, it's anti-institutionalist. And so, although much of what was being addressed was not necessarily something that would have been foreign in earlier generations, but suddenly was very shocking to many people. In the case of Brazil, what we have is we have a situation where we have the Bolsonaro presidency, and there are a lot of things to discuss about that, but the real thing I want to identify is just that from basically 2016 onward, there's been this ongoing discussion of democracy at risk. And everything is being analyzed as though this is now pushing us further along a road that is anti-democratic or whatever the case is. I want to just pull back for a moment, not to say that I agree or disagree with that, but to say that our discussions about that and our evaluations of this really derive from our concepts of what democracy is. And so the time period when we were talking about the two lefts, what we saw was they were ardent defenders of the democratic process in Venezuela as a process as being democratic because they were radical Democrats who didn't feel that institutions were very important. Institutions did not have to be permanent. What really mattered was the voice of the popular sovereign, and that you could literally have, according to the Venezuelan constitution, you could have parliaments in the street, people gathering, and they themselves had the sovereign power. At the time, the majority of people studying political science said, no, that's not institutional, it's not liberal democracy, it's not constitutional democracy, it's very dangerous, right? And then you had the sort of old wing people like Adam Jaworski and some of his students who said, listen, you gotta be careful if you put too many adjectives and expectations on democracy. Democracy is about winning and losing elections, and the people who are no longer able to hold an electoral mandate leaving office when they're supposed to. And what has happened is that those different perspectives tell us basically how we respond to what is happening in the various countries. And just to stay with Brazil. So Bolsonaro was elected. We have no reason to think that the election took place under any conditions that were not fair. And so obviously he's governing. The Temer government left. So by the Jaworski definition, democracy is there. We may not like the policies, we may have issues with the rhetoric, we have issues, but democracy is there will be new elections, and as long as that is the expectation, democracy is not in crisis. From the perspective of the mainstream of political science, people who study democracy as a regime, they're concerned about how liberal the country is. It's become less liberal. Are there more protections for citizen rights? Are there protections for the press? Do you have a president who seems to use rhetoric that goes outside of certain boundaries? Right, so these are the people, Steve Levitsky and others, who are saying democracies can die, and democracies may be dying, and the Brazilian one is very concerning for a number of reasons, many of which have nothing to do with the current election, but many of which do, right? And then you have the people on the more sort of far left perspective, the post-Marxist, the people who are supportive of the Bolivarian process at various points, perhaps no more, who will say, well, this has been a problem from the beginning because we saw what happened when you had a moderately left-leaning government and it was overturned by some sort of internal conspiracy. We argued that this was a golpe, nobody believed us, and now look what's happening, and the system is falling apart. This isn't real democracy. The inequality is driving things and is controlling this. So what I think that I want to identify is this question about whether democracy is being interrupted, whether democracy is in peril, is very much tied to these ideas that we have about democracy. Is democracy simply a decision-making process about who gets to govern and holding those elections regularly? Is democracy something more than that, in which democratic governments have to be bound by consistent rules over time, that rule of law and constitutionality is something that is fundamental in order to remain democratic? And that breaches one way or another are a problem for democracy as a regime, not simply, I don't like the policies that this government is passing. And we have to always be careful with that, because we may not like government A, and if that's a threat to democracy, what happens in government B if they pass policies that someone else doesn't like, right? And then the third case is the question of when we have this situation of a democracy that is essentially taking the decision-making power away from the people. That's the more Marxist perspective. So I just want to end up there and say, I think that when we're thinking about the question of democracy in crisis, we want to say, well, what do we mean that it is in crisis? And how did it get to be in crisis? And what are the potential solutions? But we have to be very careful that the solutions that we choose are actually going to be solutions that are going to make sense over time. Because depending on our definition, democracy may very well have been in crisis at various times over the past 20 years, and it seems to constantly survive. Maybe at a low grade. But then we also have to say, well, what does that mean? What do we mean when we're talking about a low-grade democracy? Do we just mean that the politics is not very pretty? The politics is not performing the way that we would like, that we would expect. And I think that, so speaking as a political scientist, this is one of the great challenges that we have today, where political scientists are confronted with political coalitions, with policies, and with leaders who are doing things that in many ways challenge the things that we normatively believe and accept. But one of the challenges is that a lot of the people writing about this are responding quickly, as opposed to, I think, with the tools of social science. And Georgia and I were talking about this a little bit at the beginning. The 2017 election shocked everybody. People run to political scientists for answers, which is always a bad thing. But the tools that we have are often not appropriate, or we don't have enough distance from them to say something. And I'll just end here with a brief note. When I was talking to José Antonio Chebub, who studied under Jaworski and has a very minimalist definition of democracy, we had a real great interview. And one of the things that he said, look, I really don't like this discussion about more or less democracy, because how do you prevent the following situation? This is before Bolsonaro was elected. Person A gets elected, you don't like him, therefore democracy is in danger. This is one of the great challenges that we face. We need, and this is not to say that democracy is not a risk. This is not to say that there are certain politicians, certain policies that challenge democracy, undermine democracy. But we need to have fairly stable rules about what makes democracy really at risk and under what conditions. And as far as what I have read, I find that most of the literature on this is very soft, and it's very selective in terms of its discussions. And in some ways, it's at the very least not really reflective in terms of this versus what has preceded us. And it seems like it's much more coming from a partisan side rather than really saying what's really at risk. So let me end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony. I really wish you were here when we had our conversation in November, because that was at the heart of when the room was almost on fire. The difference between the systematic, the positive versus normative. How can we tell? And it depends on your definition of democracy, right? And if you're looking for liberal democracy or different measures of electoral democracy, absolutely. So now we're going to have Mauricio.
George, can I suggest that we change the format? Again, we allow some questions and comments about politics, democracy. My presentation about something else.
Okay.
So the two questions you have.
I think, to be fair, though, we should take the questions that we had before then. And so if you have questions for, or comments, David and Tony.
Clarification.
Yeah, smaller clarification questions. So we had two hands right here. Let's start here with Bob, and then we'll...
Go ahead. This is for David. I enjoyed Tony's talk, very provocative, and I have some questions for Tony too, but since we're going first with David. So my question is this. I have, first of all, a comment, which is that the way presidential coalitions were constructed in Brazil, as we learned from the Venezuela, is to pay off people. So I don't know the answer about whether it's good or bad to have a lot of parties in the Congress, but the reality, the fact is that the price of forming presidential coalitions was often incentives toward corruption. That's a comment. My question is about Bolsonaro. And it's sort of extraordinary that he's breaking the rules and basically saying, I'm not going to try to form a permanent coalition. So is there does that make any sense? Is there some strategic idea behind that? Or is this just stupidity? And either way, what would you say about his capacity to pass an agenda?
Well, This was part of what you might call campaign promises. Many presidential candidates make promises. And as you know, Trump, one of his promises was, I'm going to build that wall. He's not really accomplished his promise yet. Of course, Trump made some other promises as well. So during the campaign last year, Bolsonaro did make some promises during the campaign. And he promised that he was going, during the campaign, that he was going to do the new politics and the old politics of give and take and building a coalition as you refer to it, either by buying your coalition, as the Metsalon showed back in 2003, 4, and 5, or passing out goodies to maintain your coalition more or less cohesive. And so Bolsonaro was saying, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do the new politics. But he did not really describe what he meant by the new politics. In these first 5 months, almost 5 months, he's had some difficulty improving his measures in Congress. And he has gone back a little bit to the point of trying to build a coalition to try to approve some of his measures. And the government has put together what they call a talent bank. The talent bank is a bank of people who could be appointed to federal jobs because they have certain talents. And this is the sort of the facade for passing out federal jobs for deputies and senators. So they have gone back a little bit on their campaign promise of not working the old politics. And Bolsonaro served 7 terms in Congress as a deputy. Supposedly, he knows very well how the old system of give and take operated in presidencies ever since. He was in Congress ever since Sarney, Collor, Fernando Henrique, Lula, Dilma, etc. But he's gone back on that promise and is trying to entice people into his governing coalition. So he has changed his modus operandi to a certain extent.
I teach international business at Pace University, and I teach a course in globalization. And right now, in terms of international business, the emphasis is on Asia and Africa, and Latin America just isn't talked about in the way that it used to be. And I remember at a conference that Mauricio had, when he had a minister from Chile, and as you know, Chile has been quite successful in South America. And the minister said, I've been to Korea and I'm very nervous because I think South Korea and Asia is where the future is, and what is Latin America going to do? And when you look at Latin America just from a broad viewpoint, you have unbelievable inflation in Argentina, unbelievable chaos in Venezuela. And for all of the difficulties that Brazil is going through, at least it's controlling inflation. And what international investors are looking at in the context of Brazil, when is Brazil going to fix the pension thing? Because if the pension stuff is not fixed, then Brazil is permanently in trouble. Now, so let me just add one more thing here. In terms of Asia, they may not be as democratic as Latin America, but the standard of living in Asia is going up because they have more social stability and they don't have all of the problems that democratic Latin America has.
I'm not sure that they'll let's
Take 3 questions.
let's take 2 more.
Yeah, I have a question for David, or a couple of related questions. This, the division between the governmentality people, governability people, and the representation people, are you talking about academics, journalists, commentators, or does this actually divide the political parties themselves? And if so, who's on what side? But I also want to ask about the representation claim. Isn't it true that the small parties, the idea that small parties provide for more representation, Isn't it true that none of them have any significant social base? They're just personalistic and local, and the claim of representation would seem a little hollow.
Let's take the second question, and then we'll.
Well, my question is an attempt to fuse the first question about new politics and the second question to focus on pensions, and ask David to talk about Sunday's mass marches in that context, in support of the so-called reform of the pension system, and the fact that Bolsonaro doesn't have a coalition in Congress, and the alternative being that he seems to be embracing is to get his supporters out on the streets. And is that new politics or old politics?
One last question in the back, and then we'll.
I have a question for Tony. Tony, what do you think of the concept of illiberal democracy that some researchers have been applying to cases like Hungary and Turkey? And I believe it fits Brazil. What do you think about it?
Okay. The pension system reform. This is the #1 policy issue in Brazil right now, is reform of our Social Security pension system. Our Social Security system is like a tsunami, and if the deficit is growing almost uncontrolled every year, and by maybe 2024, we may have half of our federal budget going into covering the deficit in the Social Security system. So, back to your point, when Dilma was impeached, foreign investors and domestic investors said, great, you got rid of her, but now, what is the new president going to do? We're going to wait and see. And they're still waiting to see. Because the pension reform was, especially by international investors, was set as the key point. This is the signal that when the pension reform is passed adequately, Brazil is going to have a flood tide of new investments, foreign investments and domestic investments. Because this is one of the ways that our federal deficit is going to be decreased and put our public accounts into order. And so everyone is waiting to see how and when Congress is going to approve this reform. Supposedly, this reform will be approved by the Chamber of Deputies sometime in June, and perhaps by the Senate maybe in August. But it won't affect that much the public deficit and the situation in 2019, but certainly will kick in as of 2020. So the foreign investors are waiting to see. Comparing South Korea and some of the Asian countries, the main comparison, I'm in the education area, is that you have a country like South Korea that decided to invest 7% of its GDP in education. What do we invest in education in Brazil? More or less 1% of our GDP. So the Asians were smart enough to decide that to progress and develop and improve, they needed to invest very, very heavily in education, not only primary and secondary education, but higher education as well. Brazil is very, very badly evaluated by the international evaluations of primary school students and secondary school students. We're perhaps, out of 60 countries, we're maybe 57 or 58 on the ability of our students in primary school and secondary school to do these comparative international PISA exams. Our higher education, our public universities have received a tremendous blow from the Bolsonaro government by trying to reduce our budgets in the federal universities. In line with Olavo de Carvalho, who is the guru of the Bolsonaro government. I'm sure you all know who Olavo is. He's a self-imposed exile in Richmond, Virginia, and he says that federal universities in Brazil are full of cultural Marxism. And so we have to really sock these universities pretty hard to try to correct this. So the big march that was not the past Sunday, about 10 days ago, was a huge march in favor of public education in Brazil and against the budget cuts. Now, these budget cuts for the education have been replaced, or let's say not going into effect, because they grabbed about maybe $3 billion of Lava Jato funds that were repatriated from countries like Switzerland, and they're going to apply that to education. So that point that was brought up by the minister from Chile, and Chile is a country that would have progressed considerably in terms of economic development and also political development. But compared with Asia, the comparisons are let's say, complicated. We've had a different wave in Latin America of governments that were elected supposedly toward the left. In Brazil, in Argentina, in Chile, Peru, Ecuador, etc. So what do we have left of the Bolivariano group? We have Nicaragua, essentially Cuba, and Bolivia. And that's about it. So we're going to go through another phase of elections now in the next 5 or 6 or 8 years. And we may have some turnarounds, perhaps in Argentina. We're not sure what's going to happen in Argentina in October with the national elections. But we're going to have to wait and see. Now, have I answered adequately?
What about the representation versus government?
Oh, representation. When I was talking about it on my political science group, and we have these discussions every once in a while when our political science groups get together in Brazil. And I remind them of the Weimar Republic. But you're right in that many of the small parties in Brazil really don't represent anything. They're personalistic parties, and usually they have an owner, who is the owner of the party. Bolsonaro's party, PSL, had an owner, or has an owner. And last year it had 1 deputy. Now they have 50-something. So this party was a very, very small, dinky party, and represented, in terms of ideology or ideas, etc., segments of Brazilian public opinion, not much at all. And so if we look at that chart, or that table that I had of all those small, dinky parties, perhaps the PCdoB is the only party that has firm political positions that it defends. The rest are personalistic parties that have no ideology and no ideas at all.
David, could you also address one point that's related to that, which is the phenomenon of party switching?
Oh, yes. Well, we're going through that right now with the parties that didn't make the threshold barrier. And we have a lot of deputies who are switching out of the small dinky parties into larger parties, or even doing party fusions of 2 or 3 of the smaller parties getting together to form a larger party. So they will have access to the party fund and also to the TV time. But we've had several instances or years following elections of party switching. The best example of party switching was in 2002, 2003, and 2006, 2007, when the PFL, which was a fairly conservative party, came up with a majority in the Senate. And in 2003 and in 2007 should have elected the president of the Senate, because the rule is that the largest party gets to elect the president of the Senate. But between the October elections and when the senators were sworn into office on the 1st of February, enough senators switched to the PMDB that the PMDB had the largest number of senators that elected the president of the Senate. And so that's an example of how party switching, in this case of the Senate, deprived the PFL of having a majority, simple majority, to elect the president of the Senate. So party switching was very important. And a lot of times the party switching, people switch to a party that can get them more goodies. And my party leader is not able to get me enough goodies, and I'm going to this other party where the party leader can get me some more goodies out of the federal government. So it's what you might call a pragmatic or logical rationale for party switching. However, the party switching was always within blocks. So you don't have someone from the right joining a party of the left, or vice versa. You have some people on the right switching parties, some people in the block in the center switching, and maybe a few among the parties to the left switching parties. So party switching was not across the whole board of ideological spectrum of parties in Brazil. That this switching was sort of by ideological blocks rather than across the board. So party switching was a big problem in Brazil, and especially I want to join a party that's in the president's coalition. Governismo, yes. I governo, sou a favor. And so, this also was part of the party switching, especially to join a party that was solidly within the president's coalition.
Yes.
I think I've turned that on.
Okay. So I want to take advantage to also just respond to your question, Larry and Bob. And I'll get to the question about liberal democracy. I'll try to be quick. The small parties tend to not be very impressive by the standards of political science, but neither do the big parties. Brazil really, with the possible exception of the PT, does not have a national party. The political parties are very much regionalized, and they are led by certain leaders. The PSDB, without Cardoso leading it, has been a mess. The PMDB can never produce its own leaders. I mean, so even the large parties are failing to do what social scientists generally expect, and that's partially because we expect parties around the world to be European parties, which they're not.
But a PT without Lula?
A PT without Lula and a PT that has now suffered because of what has happened when it was in government is going to struggle, and it may become again a regional party. I think this leads us to the Bolsonaro issue in terms of the new politics. I think what a lot of people don't seem to be getting is whether a Bolsonaro or Trump, whoever you want to put in that camp, whether they get legislation done or not is not that important, because if they don't get legislation done, they're able to advance another agenda, which is the anti-state agenda. They really see the establishment as being a challenge, and so to point out that they're not getting things done at a time when political parties have no public support only advances their cause. And I think that that's part of the Olavo de Carvalho, but it's not just him. So I think the new party politics are such that he's got popular support, he's got the power of the presidency, he's got the Banco Rural, the rural people who have always voted their own way, he's got the very strong evangelical coalition, and he generally thinks that he can get enough done without needing parties, and he may be right, and he may be more successful than certainly Temer, which is not a high bar. But the more important thing is strategically, particularly if he's able to get reelected, which is a long way off. If you have 8 years of this, you have a situation where the Congress in Brazil has been relatively strong in that it can challenge a president, but you have weak parties. If he's in power long enough, working without ongoing coalitions, he could potentially turn the balance in favor of the presidency and then weaken the parties themselves, which are already weakened, right? So I think that that's part of the new politics. The new politics is a longer strategic game. I think that's part of the strategy. In terms of Asia versus Latin America, really quickly, I've been working on Asia for the past 10, 12 years. Quickly, there's a difference in terms of the amount of democracy. The bigger issue, I think, for investment is that there's a very big difference in terms of the baseline acceptable inflation rate. And that's huge. How, on the negative side, Asian populations are aging much more rapidly than Latin American ones, so the pension funds are going to be a bigger challenge. China's already facing very, very serious demographic challenges, and it's scared very seriously of Vietnam. On the other hand, because of the Belt and Road Initiative and all the investment in China, which has been enormous in technology, one of the things that Chinese businessmen are increasingly saying confidently to Latin American business people are, we'll replace the Germans and the Americans in terms of technology, we will always need your commodities. So there may be more of a future than we think. So thank you for the question about liberal democracy. I think it's a great question. Part of the book that I'm writing is about the question of that we social scientists generally see declines of democracy when we see declines in liberalism. And these are overlapping but distinct phenomena. And so we automatically look at Viktor Orbán as being an enemy of democracy. He has increasingly been challenging liberal democracy. I think what we wind up doing is we wind up putting lots of people in the same boat. So we put Chavez there, we put Orbán there, we put Bolsonaro there, we put Trump there, we put Erdogan there, we potentially put Putin there. I think that there's sort of a liberalism that's functioning within a democratic environment and may be able to do so over a long stretch of time. And then there's a liberalism which is generally moving towards a greater amount of authoritarianism in the political system. So I would separate, let's say, Hungary from Turkey in that sense. I would also say that we can say that Brazil is quite different from Venezuela in that sense. I mean, and I don't think that it's simply a function of this is new in Brazil. I think that the Brazilian political situation and the demands of the Brazilian public is quite different from the demands that have been dominating in Venezuela. I think it's a great question. The key is liberalism is guaranteeing certain types of rights, particularly minority rights, in the through the functioning of constitutional mechanisms. And democracy for many people in this new age is a matter of the people having the ability to use their voice and turn their voice into actual policy. This effort to have direct democracy, which in many cases seems very laudable, also can be very challenging from the perspective of long-standing institutions, which generally constrain certain types of behavior otherwise.
And if I can jump in here real quick, I think just to get into the theoretical conversation, I can't help but remember that the Schmitter and Carl article, you know, what democracy is and what it's not, and the real-world dangers of conceptual stretching, right? Because if you're thinking of democracy in terms of, oh, it should provide the best solution for everything, pension reform, economic efficiency, you need to make decisions quickly. I mean, what is really democracy, at least according to Schmitter and Carl? I think it's a system to generate legitimacy to rule. That's the only thing it guarantees you, right? And you can violate all forms of norms of democracy, which is what's happening here, which is what's happening in Brazil and in a bunch of other places, but without actually violating what democracy is, which is a system of, nobody's actually said that anybody tampered with Brazilian elections. So Bolsonaro has legitimacy to rule in that sense, right? And everybody's decrying the whole normative whatever. And then what's the danger of this? The Brazilian system of sharing power, presidential coalitionism, coalitional presidentialism, to use Abranches' term, right, has been completely demonized. And if you think about it, it's not necessarily a good or bad thing. You know, if you disperse power from presidential systems with multi-party systems to then try to force the winner to share power with the loser, that's not a bad thing, or with the minority, right? But that way of doing politics has been completely demonized by the media, by Bolsonaro, by a bunch of people. And then what do you end up? Well, you end up with a system that can't generate, you know, enough, what Mauricio was saying before, enough power to form coalitions to govern. Maybe the number of parties helps with that, maybe it hurts. In the end, the Centrão sells it hard. They're going to do it whether they're 20 parties or if they're 2, right? Because if they all get together in a new PP, or, you know, if they all get together, pick one of these middle parties, they're going to sell it hard anyway. So there's a thing about the quality of representation and the legitimacy of the political process, which is going away. And I think it's a real danger from what you were saying in terms of stretching the concept of democracy. Everybody gets upset and then it becomes a regime crisis, right? I'm sorry, the moderator jumped in here as a speaker now.
No, George, I read over the last few days 2 pieces from Brazil. One of them from Carvalho, not your Carvalho,
Different Carvalho.
but from Murilo Carvalho. I mean, you read that article, an interview in Sedão. Murilo argues that Brazil may have, it's a powerful argument, they have missed the boat, and that with liberal democracy, and that the big parties have lost the capacity to aggregate and integrate the system. There's a gap between the needs of this largely urban mass using social networks, internet, mobilizing on radio issues. And therefore, the near future may be personalistic, authoritarian. He's a authoritarian, not my word. That's the implication that for the near future, that's a very strong argument coming from Murilo, who's a very conservative historian, very good one from Routeldge in Rio. And then I read Cardoso, Fleischer Cardoso's piece, where he argues more or less the same thing. He says more forcefully, using broader category, he says the political system forming after 1988 he used the word spent, exhausted, read. That's what it means. We have to either reinvent, renovate the system radically, or we are going to end up, which he thinks is a likely scenario, on a short-term basis with an authoritarian, personalistic leader. It could be Bolsonaro, could be somebody else. And that also points to the internet, the urban situation, the anomy. He does not use the word anomy. I'm using that in a broader than Durkheim sense. A real crisis in the political system that is broader than simply a simple political reform, and beyond. Brazil will have to reinvent the republicanism, and will have to reinvent liberal democracy or some other kind of democracy. Murillo says maybe liberal democracy. This panoramic historical overview. I love the analogy. It may be that weird. He said that unusual, machi liberal democracy. What happened? History is moving on. And we'll be seeing something different in the future. But Asia certainly is that kind of model. Will Latin America embrace that through some backdoor personalistic? So both thinkers and others point to the idea, the need for supporting an initiative that many people have in Brazil, who will do this through outside of the old party system. And that's a hell of a question to pose, because you're more comment on that.
Can I this is a great comment, and I think it's an important one. I've been thinking a lot about what politics is because I've been teaching an intro to politics class, and I find that students come from various perspectives. And one of the things that we do in the Western world, whether we're aware of it or not, is that we are all heirs of the regime question, which goes back to ancient Greece. And so the fundamental thing that we have in our vocabulary in political science is what type of regime does a system have? And the greatest challenge to that in political science was really Sam Huntington's Political Order in Changing Societies, where he started off the book saying the biggest difference is not between the United States and the Soviet Union, a communist and a liberal democratic state, but between levels of governance that you find. You can find a very wealthy democracy and a very poor democracy, and that's much more different than what you might find between a wealthy, let's say, second world country and first world. There's been a whole discussion in our field about governance, but a lot of that has not entirely been tied to the question of regime. And so governance generally is a lot easier because you're talking about who gets what and how it happens. Regime has a very strong normative component to it. Anything that's democratic must be good, and anything that I like must be democratic. That's sort of the way, at least we Americans think. And so the thing is, if a president or a candidate says something we don't like, it must not be democratic. And if the policies representing a certain party are, that must not be democratic because it upsets me. And a lot of what we are fighting with is a question of governance itself, right? Which are not the high questions of regime where they traditionally weren't. A government may perform very poorly, a state may not do certain things well, but the regime question is a slightly different one. I think what has happened is now that democracy is all over the world in some form of another, good, bad, ugly, liberal, illiberal, what we find is that there is more of a sense that we have to distinguish what is out there. So there is the alleged China model that Daniel Bell and others have presented as a meritocratic Confucian system, which has elements of democracy, but it's primarily just technocracy. And isn't that better for certain kind of people than a liberal democracy in a place like Haiti or Nigeria, where you don't have a very effective state, or you have a state that's predatory, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that we in the West are increasingly seeing our own reluctance to feel that liberal democracy is doing the things, it's performing the things that we expect it to do, partially because what we expect of it is ridiculous. democracy has never been a very good system at consistently over time in all countries at doing anything, except possibly preventing political candidates from being killed by each other. It really does not have a good track record. I'm a Greek. We didn't have democracy for a very long time, and all the great thinkers of the Western culture have thought democracy was a really bad thing. It's not until liberalism emerges and constitutionalism that it becomes tempered. But if you think about the streets where we are increasingly seeing politics taking place and demands that are being made, these are non-institutional demands that are being made with expectations of immediacy. At a time when parties are very weak, every party for the past 30 years has been saying it's going to renovate itself, but if you look at the political candidates who have been generated for the presidency in Brazil, other than Lula on almost every single ballot since 1988, other than either Alckmin or José Serra, I mean, who are the candidates that are being produced by these parties that know they are struggling very seriously, and we're all supposed to, so part of the thing is our language for understanding the system, I think, is quite problematic because we want regimes to do things that they don't necessarily have the ability to do, and so we are asking for different actors to come and save the day, whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's political parties, whether it's a presidential figure who's a hero figure, but we are all in some ways, the same people who are decrying the populism of the Jair Bolsonaro, maybe we're hoping that the Supreme Court would set things right, or they want the political parties to get things together so they can save the system. But I think there's a lot of confusion here, and my concern is less what's happening in political citizens, but what's happening with social scientists, because I think that we are allowing this sort of soteriological expectation in politics to lead us to think that democracy is something that it really isn't.
In his interview with Cardoso, he mentioned some names. I actually mischaracterized his argument. It's not necessarily authoritarian. He said the ones who are going to prevail are the ones who can communicate, que tenham o verbo, faz in Portuguese, a palavra, o verbo, né? Emphasizing the capacity to convey and to reach large numbers of people. For instance, he mentioned Luciano Hogg.
Well, I was going to say that's the danger, right? Because he couldn't find anybody, so he went to look for the Saturday TV guy.
He's reviewing many different people, but it is out there. Might be someone like him. That's what's next. Him or Bolsonaro or Bolsonaro.
Well, who's the big what if, right? To answer your question, who's any somewhat renewed political leadership position that we had? Eduardo Campos, who died. So that's the big what if, right?
Yeah.
He was the only new generated, he generated himself. Okay, he was part of an elite in Pernambuco too, right? But whatever. But in terms of renewing, I agree with you. It's Ciro Gomes, Marina Silva, who loses more votes every election. The PT couldn't do anything without Lula, so much so that they attached the candidate at the hip. But anyway, David has been waiting to go.
You were talking about Lula. Lula destroyed the PT last year because he egotistically insisted that I am going to be the presidential candidate of the PT. And this guy was in jail. Now, in American history, do you remember any presidential candidate who ran while he was in jail? Do you remember? 1920? Eugene Debs. Debs was in jail and ran for the presidency in 2020. What did he do that got him in jail? He was totally against any American participation in World War I. So that was considered sedition and treason, so they put him in jail. Harding was elected in 2020. In 21, he pardoned Eugene Debs. So what did Lula do? He destroyed the PT by insisting on this, and so the PT only finally decided that Haddad was going to be the official candidate in early September. The poor guy had less than 30 days to do his campaign. Had he become the official party candidate back in June or July, he probably would have had a better chance. Against Bolsonaro, I don't know. Going back to China, the question of China. China took over in Latin America where the US sort of forgot about Latin America. And China has come into Latin America with very, very heavy investments and very heavy participation and trade. China became Brazil's #1 trading partner in 2005, surpassed the US, and this has happened in other Latin American countries. China has invested tremendously in infrastructure projects in Brazil by winning bidding processes for power dams and power transmission lines and other infrastructure projects in Brazil. So China is very, very present in Latin America, mainly because the U.S. sort of forgot about Latin America, and so China is a very active player in Latin America.
All right, so now we're going to move on to.
Any questions or any comments?
Yeah, I want to sort of take on Tony a little bit here. On several levels, you know, we can debate later about liberal and illiberal, and, you know, all that. I think that's an important debate. But I think that the biggest issue right now in political science is that, to quote Routeldge, democracies die little by little. And our problem in trying to figure out what's going on is that people like Trump, people like Orban, people like, you know, perhaps Bolsonaro, that's not entirely clear, don't overthrow democracy all at once. They overthrow it or they subvert it. And, you know, no democracy functions perfectly, so there's always some degree of subversion or violation of norms. And the question that we, political science, and I think this is true of Brazil, have to face is, you know, as you see a succession of norms being violated or laws being bent in ways that they're technically legal but, you know, violate the norms, at what point does that become non-democracy? So you can make an argument that everything Donald Trump does is perfectly legal and within the authority of the president. But
Some courts have said no.
yes, and he's stepped back when that's happened. But little by little, he's declared an emergency, which has violated the spending power of Congress. He's declared, sent arms to Saudi Arabia over the objections of Congress. He's stonewalled legitimate congressional demands for hearings. You can make legal justifications for all of those things. But at some point, you know, you end up in a situation where it's, you know, it's a competitive authoritarian regime. So I think that really is the biggest challenge, is trying to sort of figure out.
Since you mentioned Venezuela too, like when did Venezuela cross the line between a liberal democracy and authoritarian, which everybody now looks back and says that they did, but where is it? Like you chip away, right? It's death by paper cut. It's, you know, and then at some point they cross that line. But
I think really briefly, the short answer is we really don't know. So if democracies die little by little, the first thing is, how do we know that they are actually dying rather than changing? Because when there are groups that are entering into government that we like, we say that they're adding new norms, right? No, I mean, but this is what often happens when you read the literature on the MSFE. So there's a lot of work by Wendy Wolford who's saying that, you know, they work outside of the law, they bring the laws that are convenient, and they wind up changing the law, and after the fact, the law changes. A lot of the works in terms of contentious politics about contentious politics being outside of the bounds and eventually being acceptable and part of the thing. And so there's a new norm that gets built. I'm not defending any of these new norms, but the problem is that norms in any democracy are always going to be changing. The question is whether they're changing in ways that are dangerous for democracy in the long run. And how do we know when a democracy is really dying as opposed to there are issues that are changing? Democracy, so much of the criticism that you hear, let's say, about the Trump administration, I mean, I heard it during the George W. Bush administration, and then we had the Obama administration, which suddenly put democracy aright. So I mean, and I'm not disagreeing with you. I think that democracies,
Tony, I have to go.
die. Yep. Anyway.
so sorry. So we got about 20 minutes left. So we're gonna.
I'll do a 5 minute presentation.
Mauricio, quick
But
presentation.
before that, I have a very fast question for both of you. David, In light of the comment that I made, are you ready to agree that big parties in Brazil, PSDB, PMDB, PT, are for the time being out of the game in being able to structure the Brazilian political system?
Well, the MDB went back to being the MDB, took off the P. The PFL became the Democrats, them. And I think, to a certain extent, the definition of the PT, which is a national party which has a very clear program that it's going after to try to enact, is a much different party than the MDB or the Democrats or the PP or the PR, these other middle-sized parties. And the MDB and these other middle-sized center parties don't really have any ideological goals or any program to go after. So to a certain extent, the PT is the only, what we might call an active party with a pretty well organized base, with a very well-defined proposal for what it wants to do. But these other parties have sort of declined. And we saw in the presidential election last year that these other parties more or less disappeared. Ciro Gomes, Marina Silva only got 1% of the vote. Back in 2014 and 10, she had 20% of the vote. So she more or less disappeared. Alckmin with the PSDB disappeared. MDB, which ran Meirelles, disappeared, wasn't even part of the competition for the election last year.
Agreeing?
Yes. Yes.
So parties will not be the big players as they were before.
No, unfortunately.
And they just have more complex.
Sure.
Anyway, one person that I think we should watch is Doria. He's making smart moves.
Yeah, John Doria is the new governor of São Paulo, and yes, he's making some very smart moves. He was elected mayor of São Paulo in the first round in 2018 and defeated Haddad as the incumbent. And Doria is now the new governor of São Paulo, and he is becoming the new national leader of the PSDB, and is trying to pull the PSDB back together as a party, and get rid of some of the corrupt members of the PSDB. Some of them have left already the party, and he will probably be a formidable presidential candidate in 2022. I would
Well,
expect.
my expectation.
Sure.
Go very fast because we are over time. Again, a commercial first. The Bildner Center and I and many of us, David and Tony and others, have produced 4 or 5 books in the recent past, dealing with the issue of reform in Brazil and political, economic, and so forth. We started with how do I do this? Reform in Brazil was a book, and that we did here as a conference. It's a Bildner event. A 2-day conference, was it, David? You were here, right?
Yes.
And that was a very readable book, still usable. You can go there and find out what the agenda of reform is. It's the same issues: macroeconomic stabilization, structural reform, now previdencia, social security, liberalized economy, competitive market economy, concessions, and PPP, special concessions, and above all, the emphasis on a new approach to development, and by emphasizing growth, conditions for growth. And then, of course, politics was part of this. So it was a kind of dual strategy: democratization and economic liberalization. We dealt with that in this very interesting volume and exercise. We also did my own book about roughly the same time on the Cardoso regime. And again, this is truth in advertising. I actually been very much influenced by Fernando Cardoso, his thinking to today. That article that I mentioned got me thinking very, very productive way. And I did a collection of essays from him back in the early, what did they say? 2001. And that's part of his own transition toward a social democracy that is also taking some mild turns toward liberalism, globalization. By the way, that's what Doria now is going to even take further. He's going to take social democracy. That'll be the formula for coming up in Brazil. And then we had at the Brazilian state, which we did it in a meeting in Brasilia, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, a lot of very interesting folks. And then I did my own book on PP, concessions, public-private collaboration in Latin America. And a lot of this is Brazil. Again, the issues, I already mentioned the reforms that have been discussed, have been problematic for Brazil since the 90s. The new issues are Previdência Social, the intensity, corruption, the new approach to development, social return to the social question, and then the political question that David and others. Again, there's really very simple cleavage historically in Brazil. The old republic was decentralized, it was more liberal in a sense. Since Vargas through the military regime, I would argue Brazil has been kind of a statist, top-down, interventionist regime. And I think the whole question of reform after 1985 was exactly to go beyond that regime, to reform it through democracy, and to reform it through liberalization. And now a question we face at this point is the new transition. Are we now, where is Bolsonaro taking Brazil? Is it going to be this agenda historically, the way I'm already characterizing it, or is he going to go for a conservative version that we don't know what that may look like? That is the debate that we would need to face if we do a new book, right? But again, Brazil, very rapidly, I'll go, Brazil has been, I like to point out the role of the military, Bolsonaro and the generals. Well, that's from day one of the republic. The Brazilian Republic came about not because of civilians, by and large. Oh, sorry about that. It was largely Marshal Teodoro de Fonseca, right? And his friend. And it was only 4 or 5 years later that he began to become more civilian. So Brazil has had a proclivity toward engaging the military rather than civilian sectors. And the people who make many revolutionary movements, so-called, through the 20th century were indeed from the military. Then, running very fast, what the hell is going on here? I'm skipping. You have the Vargas era, which is also supported by the military. The Revolution of 1930, you have then the populist democracy of from 45 to 64, and that's also kind of not authoritarian, but it was corrupt in so many ways, charges, and it was interventionist, statist, and the military coup. Well, what they objected to in 64 was the same thing. The only thing they objected to was the leftist turn and the chaotic situation in the prior year. Again, I'm doing this to review the point. If Brazil's point is Brazil's problem that it has too much of a military presence in the political system historically, is it that it has been too many Brazilians have been supported want a strong state as opposed to liberal, and they can keep going back to various formulas that would include the PT, and Bolsonaro. I don't know. I'm asking questions for future possible reference. So these are just photographs, and again, with the military regime. That's the main reference point for most of us. Larry, were you in Brazil in those years? Larry represented the New York Times.
It's interesting because in this last book that I just wrote, I spent a lot of time in military archives and met a lot of officers and talked with them. And the thing that most amazed, the big lesson that I took out of it was that I stopped thinking of the military as the military. There is it seems to me, especially at this moment, with
Too
Bolsonaro.
long, make it short, you're taking my time.
Okay, okay.
No, make it short. Very
I'll
important.
save it for the common sense.
No, go ahead, finish.
Just that, I met a lot of military officers who don't even really consider Bolsonaro a military man.
Yeah, that's part of the debate.
O capitão fracassado.
Capitão, qualquer.
And now that the book is out, the biggest quote that everybody keeps citing back at me is Rondon's last interview, where he says, o exército deveria ser o grande mudo da vida nacional. And that has resonates in this moment too.
Well, I think we have to bring that topic back into discussion, the military. That's the next conference.
Sure.
What's happening here? Nothing happens. No.
Hit the space bar, Mauricio.
Space bar.
Here, I'll help you. So, I got it. It's because you clicked on the wrong spot, right there.
Oh, well, you're a genius. These are
A
the
little distance.
perceptions, the photographs of the military regime that led to great mass mobilizations. Again, that's another topic we need to address. What happens to the mass? And now they were out of the picture recently, now they're back, right? The great masses. The last 2 weekends, education and then Bolsonaro issues. But again, with the masses and popular mobilization.
Tomorrow there'll be another mass demonstration.
By the way, one of the things that is interesting is that the struggle for democracy in 64, 63, and I'm sorry, in 85, it's after in the later 70s, was led by parties and by unions,
Labor.
the lawyers, and the Catholic Church.
Yes.
Where are those players today? In any case, the issue now is the Bolsonaro is, this is the point that I made before, all of these guys are in jail or were in jail or were impeached
It should be.
since 1988. And now we are, and Temer was, well, Temer, we have to save Temer.
Yeah, he's in jail twice, but not very long.
Yeah, we'll see what happens to him. So something is wrong indeed with the political system. Democracy, I would venture, did not work well in Brazil. So is that a problem of Brazilian society, culture, history, institutional? And what other conclusion can you reach? All of the presidents since 88 are either have been jailed or impeached, except for FHC. I mean, I think that's a pretty strong statement. Again, I'll verify I don't want to skip all this stuff. I don't want to say, I want to make one last point and then stop and open up for questions. I'm not pessimistic in relation to what's going to happen from now on in making reforms. I think, and I don't have time to develop the argument, that Previdencia Social, some form of it is going to pass. It may not be the one that many people want, but some people form. And I said the area that I work with, corruption, some of us work on, that's, if Moro survives, something will happen, right?
Probably.
Probably. The economy guy, Guedes.
Yeah, Paulo did.
Paulo Guedes. Well, something will happen. So if he goes, it's a big hit and so on.
Yes.
So on.
Yes.
So I think something's going to happen, and the one that I see happening is with the third big minister, the guy who is the infrastructure minister, Tarcísio.
Freitas. Also a former military officer.
Also former. He's doing great. He says essentially, and I want to stop here, I think we don't have time. He went back and he is building on the plans that both the pre-PT, the PT, and the Temer teams had massage projects, right? Meaning building railroads in Brazil, meaning new airports, meaning ports in the north, from Mato Grosso to Manatatiba, and to export through the river, through the Amazon, and then use waterways to export soy and other productions from not only the Cerrado area, which is a new area, but also from part of the Amazon. So it's an issue. Or the question of environment is an issue, right? Big time. But this is moving forward. And the evidence we have is that they already put up some projects. Some of them are going. They were stopped before, and they are having meetings in São Paulo and other places in the last few days, in the next few weeks, and they are moving forward. Ironically or interestingly now, and this is another brilliant point that I'm going to make. My faith in Brazilian democracy is not so much, or not necessarily only on the federal government, at the level of the state. I actually believe that states are much better off than the federal. São Paulo is a case in point, which is a main state in the union. The southern states are not doing too bad, actually. Minas Gerais, also Rio, it's a disaster area for other reasons. And then the north is the new north, which is moving forward, meaning the Mato Grosso up north of the Amazon. And the Nordeste, that's a mixed bag. Actually, Bahia is doing reasonably well, right?
Ready to speak, yeah.
And others. So I think that and I'm going to stop, that one element that needs to be taken into account in Brazil as we analyze the relationship between democracy and reform is the role of state-level political structures and movement. We need to pay more attention to that. My guess is that if Bolsonaro collapses, São Paulo is going to keep on moving forward, and so will many other states. That'll be my guess. I'm going to stop here because we need well time.
Also, thank you, Mauricio. I guess we're right about on time. I just maybe open up for one or a few more questions. I'm just gonna like to push, maybe this will help with the conversation as well, I'm just gonna push Mauricio back a little bit on the pessimism in terms of he made a comment that democracy has failed Brazil. I would like to push back a little bit. Failed in what? Because I think we don't know if that's a good or a bad thing that every president in Brazil, other than Fernando Henrique Cardoso, is in jail. It could be, sorry, I don't know if that wasn't on. We don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. I mean, if they were all corrupt before and none of them went to jail, and now they're going to jail,
Right.
that could be actually reform. Like most of the socioeconomic indicators for Brazil since democracy, the data is actually unquestionable that the effect of the years in democracy were very positive. There's this young group of young scholars that have gone on the internet. It's called BR Dados, BRDADOS. And all they've done is show time series of a series of social indicators, not only economic statistics, unemployment, formal and informal markets, but also education, health standards, a series of things. And it turns out that the data is very clearly on the side of, okay, now there's a correlation, times change, economic booms, whatever. But the data seems to support that democracy has actually increased equity in Brazil. Even though very turbulent, of course, very corruption, all that other kind of stuff. But, growing pains, but I mean, cup half full, cup half empty.
Yeah.
This is Brazil after all, right? I mean,
This is Brazil.
but anyway, so can we take one or more, two comments? We'll favor people who haven't had a chance to speak yet.
Yeah, you mentioned you don't run from prison to get elected, but from exile. There's the history of South America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And I think that creates a kind of a magical thinking. Deus ex machina, God from the sky. In other words, the bad guy's dead, the good guy's coming back, we're all going to be in good shape. That's a bad sequence and circumstance that I think creates a certain kind of entrapment. It's maybe different now because there has been democracy for years and years and years.
Yeah, but what's Bolsonaro's middle name?
Messias.
The Messiah.
Well, there you go.
Can we get another, anybody else with, perhaps somebody who haven't had a chance to ask yet?
I took a group of students, MBA students, to San Paulo. We visited Bradesco, and the Bradesco Bank said that one of the primary benefits of both the Bolsa Familia and the Zero Hunger Project is that it dramatically increased the income per capita in northeast Brazil. At the south of Brazil did not benefit. I brought this up because we mentioned whether democracy worked or didn't work. And in the Foreign Affairs magazine, they say the huge achievement of the Lula years is that 30 million people in Brazil left absolute poverty and became working class. So an argument can be made that the Cardozo-Lula years were a tremendous benefit to the lowest income people of Brazil, and maybe, and in fact I used to say, and I've heard people on the left criticize this, that Lula governed Brazil like playing the violin. He held the voters in his left hand, but he governed with his right hand. And then Dilma comes in, and then she abandons the right-wing economic policies of Lula, and then all the problems ensued. But nonetheless, there was this huge increase in the living standards of the poorest people between the 16 years of Cardozo and Lula.
Absolutely, right? A combination of macroeconomic stability, which then fuels the ability to redirect some social spending towards,
So in that sense, democracy worked.
Well, commodities were.
Come on.
There was the
But nonetheless, the Bolsa Familia and Zero Hunger were major steps
I happen
forward.
to agree that the reforms did play a big role. And I happen to agree that there is a consensus in Brazil between the Lula thinking and Cardoso's thinking. And one of the tragedies, they polarized the relationship in public, politically was such a mess. But in fact, there was considerable agreement on actual policy.
It's just very briefly, the other thing that happened is when you knock down inflation to 4 or 5%,
Yeah.
working class people were able to get
Absolutely.
apartments and flats. And in my 15 years of going to San Paulo, I couldn't believe all of these large housing projects which were able to develop because of low inflation.
We have been very happy because for many of these years, I questioned myself whether I was a neoliberal or was inside or was a bad guy. In fact, I've been arguing instinctively, and I'm not an ideological person, that the reforms were and continue to be necessary. Brazil must reform, must change. I think they further. So yes, Brazil has improved, I would agree with that. A lot of it has to do with these factors, with the state level
However, the Bolsa Familia that Lula instituted in 2003 got to the point of including maybe 12 or 13 million families. And this helped him get reelected in 2006. Timothy Barr and Wendy Hunter did a very interesting study of the 2006 elections, correlating the level of the PT vote and the number of Bolsa Familia families in the municipality. And the coalition was very strong, more Bolsa Familia, more PT votes. But when you have the opposite, and we had, with Dilma, we had 2 years of very, very bad recession in 2015, 16. And what this did was increase the income inequality. Brazil has one of the worst income inequalities, the Gini index of almost all countries in Latin America. And so what that showed was that when you have the downturn, the upper class or the upper middle class, the economic class, reaps more benefits or can defend themselves better in the recession period than can the poor. When you're talking about not 30 million became working class. Working class means you have a job. What we're talking about is that they moved up from class D or E into lower class C in terms of income. But the problem with the Bolsa Familia is that it was not tied to achieving a job training. So Bolsa Familia gave the family an income, but it did not include job training. So they just continued on their Bolsa Familia income. It also did not, it should have required that all Bolsa Familia families keep their kids in school, but that was not well enforced. So you have a lot of school evasion on the part of these families, where the kids are put to work or try to find some sort of informal jobs or some sort of income and drop out of school. So yes, Lula was very successful with this Bolsa Familia program, and they had what Dilma began, even when she was one of Lula's ministers, was Minha Casa Minha Vida, these public housing projects for very low-income families, which was done all over Brazil in a lot of different states. Now, looking at the state situation, you have Rio de Janeiro, which is a total basket case in terms of deficit and public works, etc. You have other states which are in pretty bad shape. Rio Grande do Sul, over the last 15 or 20 years, has had less revenues than it has expenditures. Minas Gerais has gotten into the same situation because of the PT government that they had, and Minas Gerais is in pretty bad fiscal shape as well. But some other states are doing better in the Central West and also in the Northeast and in the northern region.
David, a quick question for David. Why was Dilma impeached?
Oh, that's a good question. Depends on who you talk to. Now, as was mentioned here, some people say that was a constitutional coup or a political coup. But no one compares the impeachment of Collor. Collor was impeached back in 92. And Collor had done some misdeeds. And so everyone says, no, but he had some misdeeds. And Dilma had no misdeeds. Well, the problem is that in a Republican presidential system, the Constitution includes impeachment. And impeachment is not a criminal trial, it's a political trial. You're impeached for political reasons rather than for penal reasons. And so Dilma's impeachment was, number one, because she had difficulties relating to Congress. Collor, who was impeached, came back to be a senator. I mean, that's quite a rare Brazilian thing. And so he said, I told Dilma 3 different times, you have to improve your relations with Congress. You're not doing very well, like Lula had great relations with Congress, and your congressional relations are almost zero. That's what got me impeached back in 92. I didn't pay any attention to Congress, and I had very bad relations with Congress. And so he said, she didn't listen to what I said, the voice of experience. So Dilma had there was an interview with this PT deputy who said, I've been in Congress now 6 years. She never ever called me on the phone. And 2 weeks before impeachment, he said, she called me 3 times. So Dilma's main problem was bad relations with Congress, but also the recession was very, very heavy as well in terms of getting her impeached. But Temer was the vice president, so a lot of the parties in the coalition broke off from her government. The PMDB and others as well broke out of the coalition. And that's what put together the impeachment, thinking that they would get a better deal with Temer as president. But that was really not the case.
There, I have a question for you, fast one. You lived in Brazil and worked in Brazil many years.
Yeah,
Has Brazil gotten better or worse since you were there?
much better. I mean, I first went to Brazil in the 70s. And I was just thinking, you know, Georgie, along the lines that you're talking about. You know, Brazil today and Brazil then, by every measure, you know, political stability, or you know, democratic expression, you know, the economy, everything is better.
Basic infrastructure, right?
Oh, man. I mean, I remember having to book phone calls, you know, and 1 in 3 phone calls would go through me.
Right. And you have to wait 2 years to be able to buy a phone
Exactly,
line?
and then, or you have to go to the black market and pay $1,500. This is in the early, you know, mid.
Or you needed a despachante for everything, which is what, a greaser?
Yeah, yeah.
And now you don't, yeah.
Right. So everything along those lines has changed.
So Larry,
Well, getting to that point, back in 1998,
Getting better.
Yeah.
we had about 100,000 cell phones in Brazil. after the elimination of privatization of public routes, we now have 250 million cell phones in Brazil. We have more cell phones than population.
Yeah. But, George, on the larger point, you know, there are people like Routeldge Sharma who say Brazil needs to be more like China. That seems to me to be an insane argument. Because we can say whatever we want about Brazil and its flaws, but the model that Brazilians have chosen to follow, the policies they've chosen to follow, have not been imposed upon them by a one-party dictatorship. They've been chosen, for better or worse, by the people in elections. And when you look at the percentage terms, I mean, yes, the Chinese lifted 300, 400 million people into, you know, out of poverty. Well, you know, if you look at it in percentage terms, what happened during the Cardozo and Lula years as a percentage of the population is quite similar to what happened in China. And it happened in a democratic system. Not,
Where, you know, respecting norms, respecting rights,
absolutely.
having to convince other people that what you want is the correct thing.
And
Why not?
approving your policies and conduct.
Absolutely. And, you know, I was a correspondent in China for 3 years.
What period?
82, 83, 84. I went from Rio to Peking and then back to Rio years later. And, you know, the Chinese system, you know, what was it, the phrase you used, a Confucian,
Well, it's called
somebody-
Confucian meritocracy.
Yeah, you know,
That's
I mean,
Daniel Bell's
I would question maybe part of the meritocracy aspect of that.
I have a
because
colleague that only studies corruption in China, so I don't know if you would call it a meritocracy.
a Stalinist Confucian state, whatever. But Brazil is in every respect, I think, better today than it was then.
That's very interesting, and I thank you for your honest reply. Again, Larry Roller was representing the New York Times in Brazil for 20 years.
Well, 10 years for the Times, and before that, in the dictatorship for Newsweek.
He knows about Brazil. I guess
From what I can remember, not exactly on a friendly relationship with Lula, right? From what I can remember,
But, you know, I mean,
at least towards the end.
yeah, no, I mean, you know, my case, as they call it, they always call it the Roeder case, you know, is another sign that democracy
The
works.
Cachaça thing.
Yeah, that business, yeah.
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 But, you know, it was a sign that the system worked because I didn't get kicked out. The institutions worked the way they're supposed to work. The courts got involved, the press got involved, and the president had to retreat.
But can I say also that it's interesting that that case where an American news reporter was almost persona non grata because of writing certain things, we all forget that. And so when Bolsonaro makes comments, everyone, oh my God, the press is being attacked. And
Yeah.
this is not completely unique. The question is what happens in the everyday universe of political institutions and the application of law. Politicians always wander around in places maybe they shouldn't be. But so to me, when I hear NPR saying, "Oh, Brazil's authoritarian president," I say,
Well, I mean,
he
I
does
would-
things you may not like, but he was just elected.
Democratically elected.
With this,
I-
there are lots of reasons to be concerned, but
Both things can
I
be
like
true.
referring to Al-Sisi as being authoritarian. I think we got to be really careful with that term. And I was in a conference in Lhasa a couple of days ago, and somebody was comparing the military authoritarian period with the current authoritarian period. And I was looking at him like he was out of his mind. I'm saying, there are many things to complain about, but at the same time, you're talking about the military period. Do we not remember it?
Yeah.
Or are we so heavily stretching our concepts in ways that don't make sense? Because there's always a space for criticism, but you have to be really careful, I think, with the language you use.
His case in Brazil was very exemplary. He wrote a story in the New York Times Magazine about Lula and his drinking problem, but he went even further and talked about Lula's father's drinking problem, which killed Lula's father. And Lula was so irate that he wanted to expel Larry from Brazil. But the justice minister, Márcio Tomás Bastos, said to Lula, You can't do that. You don't have the legal mechanisms to expel him. He has a Brazilian wife and has Brazilian children. You can't do that. Do you remember, when the last foreign correspondent was expelled from Brazil? Lula didn't remember. He said, this was during the military regime, when a French correspondent was expelled. And that's the only recent time when any foreign correspondent was expelled. And so if you try to do this, I'm leaving your government, right, the next day. So he called Lula right up short, and then Lula sort of shut up. But the New York Times did what you would call a mea culpa, right?
No, I wouldn't call it
What
that.
would you call it? What did the Times do?
Jeitinho.
A jeitinho, right?
Yeah, it was a jeitinho, yeah.
Okay.
The Bastos and the lawyer that the Times hired came up with some anodyne language.
Okay.
But the thing is that, independent of that, Sergio Cabral, who was then a senator from Rio de Janeiro,
Right.
he asked for a habeas corpus so that I would not be expelled, and the court ruled in his favor. And because in Brazil, third parties can get involved in that sort of thing.
Yes, that's true.
And he asked for a habeas corpus, and I asked him why once. Why did you do that? He says, because my father's a journalist.
That's true.
And so the courts worked, and the president had to back down. And that's the lesson that I take away. And, people still ask about it in Brazil, and I always say, no, I don't have resentment for it. I mean, because things worked the way they were supposed to work, and, parabéns para você.
Well, now with Bolsonaro, he's been obliged to back down several times.
Right.
The saving factor of Bolsonaro's government are the generals that he has in his government, who are very moderate and very smart guys. Lula saw a commercial advertisement on TV from the Bank of Brazil, which emphasized diversity. He didn't like it, so he called up Bolsonaro. Very impulsive. He called up the president of the Bank of Brazil and said, take that damn commercial off the air, and he did. Then Bolsonaro went even further and said, all TV commercials by any state enterprise have to be approved by us in the government. And then General Santos Cruz came to him and said, Mr. President, you can't do that. There's something called the Lei dos Estatais, the law of state enterprises, which prohibits any type of intervention like that. So the general said to Bolsonaro, you can't do that.
I'm starting to think, and let me throw this out to you guys. I'm starting to think that in some ways, Bolsonaro is a kind of mirror image of some aspects of the of some of the negative features of the Lula PT period, the populism and the authoritarianism. What happened with me was an authoritarian spasm on the part of what in Portuguese they would call Lulapetismo.
Right.
And you see Bolsonaro called a populist, and you see these authoritarian spasms in his case too.
Impulsive, right?
Right, and impulsive.
Spasm.
Yeah.
But democracy as a system can't prevent those spasms from
Right,
occurring,
it
right?
can
From the
only-
sparks. What it can do is prevent them from taking hold,
There
right?
you go.
Going into
And that's
There
what
you
the
go.
system of institutions are made to.
Exactly.
You can't prevent the spark or the whatever messianic impulses
Right.
or what have you. What you can do is prevent them from actually taking
Going-
hold. Maduro decides today he's going to give an apartment to a person who threw a mango at his head, and the institutions of Venezuela don't prevent that, right? I mean that's the difference. You can't prevent the actions of an individual, but you can keep them from going through.
Right.
There's a question in the back.
I'm kind of uncomfortable the way you see the situation in Brazil. As if democracy there
Walk to the microphone.
is not a risk. Well, as a Brazilian citizen, I feel very uncomfortable, even more, with a president that praises the dictatorship. And I like to remind everybody here that, and I have the numbers, Bolsonaro was elected with 57.8 million people. Not necessarily because of him. Most of those that voted for him were against the Workers' Party. And number two, very important, 47 million people voted for the Workers' Party. And 11 million rejected both. So here we are talking about 58 million people in Brazil who didn't vote for Bolsonaro. So we see what's happening in my country is a country completely politically divided, polarization. It seems to me that the quality of democracy over there is not as good as you may be projecting. What do you say?
Thank you.
That's a great question, Jason.
You want to say from the floor? We're losing another giant.
Go ahead, you answer that.
I'd like to close the question from my end.
Sure, yeah, no, we'll have the last word.
Wait, is it Tony?
Yeah, no, but let Tony answer, right?
Yes.
That's okay.
No, but we're running out of time.
Oh,
Are you optimistic or pessimistic for the next 4 years? Brazil?
I think all three should
Why
answer
don't,
that.
why don't you guys start and I'll finish up and I'll get back to Jason's
I
question.
think I should go last because I'm moderator. So you guys are the actual speakers.
She's right that the election was very highly polarized, and now the consequences in 2019, Brazil is still quite polarized. The previous elections were a polarization between the PT and the PSDB, but in the first round last year, the PSDB disappeared among several of the other central parties, just didn't catch on. And it became a polarized election between Bolsonaro and Haddad. So what we have in Brazil right now in 2019 is a president who was democratically elected. We have a Congress that was democratically elected last year, and a number of state governors and state assemblies as well. So the democratic process in terms of the elections last year functioned very well, with no complaints of any corruption or manipulation of the elections. So we have a situation where we have a democratically elected president who has some, let's say, conservative or unusual ideas. Some of them he's trying to put into effect, and some he has not been able to put into effect. But the Congress is still quite strong and has very strong powers, and he's been frustrated several times by votes in Congress where he was not able to pass what he wants to do. He has done several things by decree and also by medida provisória, a provisional measure, which is a temporary decree which lasts for 6 months, and Congress can either let it expire, approve it, or disapprove it. So he did, some of his campaign promises were to, as the U.S. constitutional amendment says, keep and bear arms. So he did a decree where you can keep arms, and he eased the restrictions on people buying arms, firearms. And he did another decree about bearing arms, who could take an arm with him or her out on the street, and included a lot of different categories of people who could bear arms, like journalists who are doing criminal coverage and investigation, for example. But this has been challenged and probably will be either altered or defeated in part by Congress, if not perhaps even at the Supreme Court. So we have a situation which I consider to be, in Brazil, a democracy which is functioning more or less, although we have a very conservative president. And this is the first time we've had a very conservative president since Paulo was elected back in 1989. We've had supposedly democratic center or center-left presidents ever since Paulo was impeached. But we have a democracy which is functioning more or less fairly well. If you disagree with Bolsonaro and his ideology and his ideas, you consider it to be an authoritarian government which is not democratic. But as was discussed here by the members of this panel, just because you don't like the person or you didn't vote for the person doesn't mean that democracy has been finished or it no longer is a democratic system.
Tony, real quick, we really, if we can keep it to a minute or two, everybody. Tony?
So are you optimistic, David?
Yeah, very optimistic.
You didn't actually say it.
Yeah, I'm optimistic that the institutions in Brazil will continue to function. We have the courts, we have the federal police, we have the federal prosecutors who have been working very, very successfully in Lava Jato against corruption, and they're going to continue to function. The courts as well, Congress, and the president. So I'm optimistic that the institutions will more or less continue to function, and many of Bolsonaro's impulses will be controlled.
I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic to answer your question. I try to look at this as a social scientist long-term view, and Brazil this is a lot of what we see is not inédita. A lot of it we've seen in different phases in different ways. Brazil tends to swing back and forth. We see this a lot. And I think a lot of what we are seeing is a backlash, but it's a backlash within a democratic context. To get to your questions and your concerns, Geisa, I always try to be a little careful, particularly when I'm speaking about another country's politics, because I'm not a Brazilian. Obviously, I've been studying Brazil for 20, however many years, and I have many friends who are Brazilian. I would not say that everything is okay in Brazil or good or what have you. My question is, what do we mean when we say democracy is at risk? So in terms of praising the dictatorship, when I was in Brazil in 2002 during the presidential elections, Lula himself was saying we have to change the modelo econômico do Brasil. And what was he saying? He was lauding the model of the Brazilian military government against what was happening under the Cardoso administration. It's a very long motif in Brazilian politics to go back and find whoever they want to be a good thing, and very often the military is some sort of source for different people at different times. In terms of who people vote for or against, I think it's always dangerous to say, well, people voted for this person and against this person. At the end of the day, all we know are what the results are. And the results are is that more people voted, and in this case, a significant majority voted in favor of one candidate for the other. It doesn't necessarily mean they support all of his agenda. In fact, opinion polls seem to suggest that they don't suggest most of his agenda, the majority of people. Again, I'm not justifying the agenda. My goal is to figure out what does this mean. And I think, let me stop there.
In terms of the question that I posed, may I answer to?
Yeah, sure, but let me answer before you answer, because then you answered your own question. I think it'll stay messy. My ceiling for optimism for Brazil is that we tread water for a while. And I think it's fair to say also because it's a period of economic contraction, it's a period of social contraction. And if we tread water for a little while, I mean, maybe it's the best that we can do. I think that the polarization in this current election, in this current climate, is something to be concerned about for the health of the everyday democracy. I happen to agree a little bit with Tony with the sense that I don't think that the letter of democracy, none of the rules, formal rules of democracy have been violated. Plenty of norms have been violated, which is a danger for if you think of democracy in terms of liberal democracy. And you know what becomes acceptable and this death by paper cut argument type of thing that democracies die slowly. But I think if we end up with a messy couple of years, it doesn't solve the economic problems, it creates a further contraction, then I think we are in a bigger danger. But at the same time, it seems to me that certain escape valves or certain controls, institutional controls to prevent the worst from happening. Like, I almost got eaten alive in November here when I said that I don't think Brazil is fair to compare Brazil to Venezuela at all. It's not, for the left or for the right. I think Brazil's democracy functions much better. And okay, you have corruption, you have this and that, but people go to jail. People get voted out of office and they leave.
They leave and go to jail.
So far, anyway, and then they go to jail, which Taylor has also gone. So
Twice.
I am very, very cautiously optimistic, but what I call optimistic might not be what most people call optimistic, which is I think if we are in trouble for a little while and we figure out what the next coalition is going to be to keep Brazilian, society moving forward, I think that's my.
My own one, I agree. I am guardedly optimistic, more or less on the same line. However, we need a second conference about 6 months from now
Yeah.
to judge what's happening, whether they got out of the reform process, really started, and I think they will do.
I think the market was overly optimistic now, and now I think they're pricing down, right? All those that added thing that they gave. We don't know what the economic team is going to be able to deliver. The Previdência thing or not, we don't know.
So we need a new conference 6 months from now.
Yeah.
And also tax reform.
Yeah. Tax reform, wage reform.
Do we do a new book?
Do another book, right?
We get together again and we keep having the conversation. I'd like to thank everybody for coming and for all your questions. We really appreciate it. Have a great summer. Thank you, Mauricio, and the Builder Center again.